Hello, everyone. We are with Smokey, the co-founder of Berachain. I have two questions to start with. Number one, why did you deceive me? Because the testnet says boobs, and I joined the testnet and I couldn't see any. So,
You know what? We're working on making that part of the tech stack better.
okay.
Just doing our best there, but we haven't quite locked down the boobs technology as of yet.
Okay.
We're on the ways though. So I'll keep you in the loop as we unlock better parts of the boob stack.
Thank you. Glad you're working on that stack, and that was what I was most interested. But it's fine, right? Like we have everything else. And so like another important question I want to start with, I see you have a lot of bears in your team. Where did you find so many bears in Web3?
Yeah, I think if you just spend enough time in remote regions and certain forests, and every now and then you can find, I think some very variable team members. So that's really what we've optimized for. I think some have started as bears, some become bears, but either way, they all sort of end up as bears. So yeah, man, that's sort of our approach.
I didn't think it was possible for bears to do all this stuff, but obviously, like I'm mid-curve, I don't know enough. So that's why we're doing this podcast. So who are you, Smokey? What's your little bit background?
I've always been a founder, or in other cases, a venture builder. So I guess I spent the first half of my career working in healthcare effectively. So building and scaling companies in that space. I spent a little bit of time in Silicon Valley and did the whole fundraising thing over there. And then spent quite a while actually in VC on the other side of the table. So, my thought was effectively that I've been involved in crypto since 2015, 2016. One of my first investors in my first company was sort of very involved, very deep in the ETH Foundation. So as a result, I just sort of found myself exposed to the space relatively early. And then had a number of friends who were pretty deep in the space from 2018, 2019 onwards. So I would pay more and more attention over time. And as things started getting interesting, I think especially as we were all sort of locked inside over COVID, teamed up with my friend / co-founder Papa Bear. And we've been, sort of building ever since.
Thank you for sharing that. And how did this journey start, right? Like what was the origins of Berachain? I heard you guys started with a NFT collection inspired by Ohm 3,3 meme. So what's the journey?
A little bit. It's more, I wouldn't say it's quite that, but, there's definitely overlap. Myself and Papa were very active in a number of these like DeFi projects, especially over 2020, 2021. Whether that was Curve or Ohm or Alchemix or Frax, so on and so forth. So we spent a lot of time in some of those different discords. The Olympus Discord was by far one of the most entertaining ones, and definitely had a number of figures who I think persist to this date in different forms. So I think at some point, especially around the time of the parallel NFTs were getting off the ground, we sort of saw the degree of quality and adoption that one can get from a cool NFT collection. We just thought it would be interesting to launch something and see what happened with it. So without any meaningful motivation, we were just like, okay, let's draw these 100 JPEGs of bear smoking weed and see what happens. So we did that. We raffled them off / minted them out amongst members of the Ohm and other discords. And then over time, we were just trying to think what could we do that makes these a little more interesting, a little more fun. And we were like, what if we made the NFTs rebase like Ohm? Because on one hand, it allows for a floor price to decrease over time. It allows for more users to get involved as scarcity decreases. In the case of new NFT collections, it allows for effectively, the people who are in and involved the earliest to be rewarded the most and to, basically have the greatest upside, which I don't think is uncommon across crypto as a whole. And then I think it allows us to actually do something interesting in terms of just building something fun, right? And since a lot of the initial user base of that community weren't your typical NFT holders, it wasn't wag me, look at my fucking, I'm not gonna name names, but it wasn't I think cringy NFT community. It was more okay, there's some dudes who just thought this was funny and see where it goes. I think that we ended up attracting a lot of folks who were actually very DeFi minded and who were thinking a lot about things that were not just how cute their JPEGs were, right? So when we actually decided to add that layer of game theory / mechanics around making the bears rebase, etc., I think we found a lot of people who were like, oh, that's pretty cool. I want to pay attention to this and get involved. And then over time, we spent time talking to this community as it grew from a couple from tens of people to hundreds, and then now thousands plus. And very much found that I think there's an opportunity to work on problems that needed solving within the space. And I think a lot of L1s take the approach of, there's a professor at some university, they developed a funky new consensus mechanism, or something that may solve a classic point within the blockchain trilemma, or perhaps all three, right, in terms of scalability and security and decentralization. And then they basically try to find a way to push that narrative upon people, right, and to make it into something that they're like, yeah, we need this. I think we sort of went the opposite way. We basically talked to a number of people, we talked to the community, and then we said, okay, how do we turn this into something? How do we actually answer the problems and help, to solve some of the things that they faced in the past? And that's sort of what brought us to Berachain. We basically found that there was a gap between the ways that people wanted to interact with the chains and applications that they were using and the way they currently were interacting. And that, basically people were faced with this trade-off that didn't make a ton of sense, where if they wanted to effectively, if they wanted to push security and, basically contribute towards the chain security on the network by, staking with a validator, that same capital was no longer effectively utilized within the ecosystem itself. It could no longer contribute to liquidity. So it seemed very nonsensical to us that if you wanted to help secure an ecosystem, you had to take away from the on-chain, transactions per se, or the on-chain availability of capital that really makes, I think, a chain live or die. So our goal was to figure out how we could align those things at a chain level. And that's sort of how the idea of Berachain and proof of liquidity came to be.
Awesome. I'll dive deep into proof of liquidity, but I just want to set some context and from what I understood. So firstly, I heard about Berachain because one of my friend, AK I know him from the Ronin ecosystem. He bought an NFT for 69.420 ETH, and I was like, "Yo, what is this guy doing?" Right? Like that's like NFT in this market. And then he's like, this is gonna pay off. Like it's probably gonna be incentivized later. And then I realized like what you were doing with Olympus is like, if you hold this NFT, you got all the later mints, right? Like so person who minted the first NFT have a lot of layers of these NFTs, which are also certainly expensive. And then I went into a I met fDUB. They have a very nice podcast. I went into a deep rabbit hole and I was like, yo, these guys seem so cool. It's so meme friendly. They're not taking themselves so seriously when it comes to perception, but the tech and everything that's being done is super serious, right? Like it's not a joke. It's not Doge. Right, like it's like high level stuff which is happening, and here we are. I want to ask a very basic question: how is Berachain different from another L2 or another L1? And like, if you have to compare it with an Optimism or even a Solana, like how would you do it?
Like, I guess the way that we think about Berachain is and the way that it really works at a high level is that proof of liquidity, which is, I think, a lot of like the novelty around it, is a variant of delegated proof of stake, right? So normally in proof of stake, you have a network that's secured by a number of validators or a number of nodes, and you basically buy the gas token of the network. You put X amount of that capital, you put X amount of that capital at stake per se to run a node. Such that if you submit invalid transactions, you can be slashed, so on and so forth, if your validator is engaging in misbehavior effectively. But I think the key there is that those tokens, like when you were taking those tokens and you were locking them with a validator under running a validator themselves, they're effectively they're no longer contributing to the ecosystem. They're just sort of there contributing to security, which should not be downplayed. But they're there in that role, and they can be market bought and acquired in that manner. In proof of liquidity, the only way to earn the staking token of the network, which is in our case called BGT or Bearer Governance Token, is by first providing the value of doing the work of providing liquidity to the ecosystem itself, right? So the only way to earn the staking token that secures the network is by first doing the work of providing liquidity to it. So you can't just go and market buy BGT. You can't just like go on Binance or Coinbase or whatever and buy a bunch of BGT. You actually have to first provide liquidity to a set of DeFi primitives. And eventually, any contract that's secured by governance or that's approved by governance across Berachain. So the way that works is, Berachain has a full, EVM environment. So if you could deploy a smart contract for an application, on Optimism or on Arbitrum, what have you. You could also deploy that on Berachain with very little to no modifications. We are, EVM equivalent. But at the same time, there's a couple of these DeFi Legos that are built into the chain as a means of bootstrapping that security and defragmenting liquidity at the chain level. So there's a ambient liquidity DEX, there's a perps vault, and there's a stablecoin lending market that are all basically like enshrined chain applications, where the LPs of those protocols and certain pools within them can earn that Bera governance token, and then basically use that to stake with a validator or delegate that to a validator to secure the network. So the part that gets interesting there, in my opinion, is that you actually have, I think, a well-aligned exchange of value, right? In order to contribute towards security, you must have first contributed towards liquidity, because we really think that, there are tons and tons of proof of stake networks that have tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars sitting relatively idle in their validator sets, but actually have, absolutely no activity on chain. And I think that's the opposite of what we'd like to see. We'd like to see, a very secure validator set, but also a massive amount of on-chain activity if we want to, operate a blockchain. So the way that this works from a reward/an emissions point of view is that under proof of liquidity, validators actually have a very, unprecedented role in economic incentives. The validators themselves, the set of, 100-ish validators, since it is, Tendermint consensus, are actually able to determine the rewards rates across the network. So each validator effectively has its own like pie chart or distribution, if you will, of their block rewards. So instead of validators and their delegates keeping off their block rewards, those validators actually help redirect their emissions or their liquidity every time they win a block towards different pools on the network. So a validator could choose to push all of its emissions towards a single pool on the DEX, or half of it towards pool A on the DEX and half of it towards the perpetual swap, et cetera, right? And what it means is in a similar manner to how you might think about curve gauges or frax gauges, if you're familiar, it basically means that the aggregate of all those validators' distributions of their emissions determines the APYs or the rewards rates on different primitives within the network. And where we think proof of liquidity gets very exciting from an application or protocol builder's point of view is that you basically are able to power your application by building on Berachain. In that, someone can launch an NFT AMM or an options vault or anything that really requires liquidity and then generates fees or token emissions or something, and then pass a governance vote to have that join that set of smart contracts that can have emissions directed towards it by the validators. So it's like if initially you could only direct towards the swap, the DEX, the perps, the lending market that's built into the chain. Over time, it could route it to that NFT marketplace or an options vault or a social fi platform or a game or whatever it may be. And I think that's where you get a major unlock. So when we look at comparing it to something like a Solana or an Optimism, of course there's differences in the tech stack. We're an L1. We're built on our own implementation of EVM on Cosmos, etc. We do use a variant of proof of stake, but not quite the same idea of proof of stake. On Berachain, on one hand, users are able to effectively rehypothecate their liquidity into security, and they're also able for application builders to become powered by the chain itself, which is something that I don't think we've really seen in other ecosystems to this date.
That was a long one, and it was pretty interesting. So I think I have a little bit more questions with regards to it. Very basic. So I personally think this model of BGT and Bera token, you have to, if you want to participate in this ecosystem, you have to lock in your money and liquidity, and you get BGT tokens, and which is very different from like you mentioned, right, from other ecosystem where you can just buy and lock the money and you can't do much with it, right? But your gas token is completely different. And BGT is completely different, right? So what was the thought process? What game theory are you thinking that this might enable?
Yeah, I think it basically gives people trade-offs based on their risk parameters, right? You can either choose to, hold BGT, which can at any point in time be one-way burned into liquid Bera, right? So you can turn BGT into Bera, but you can't turn Bera into BGT. You can choose to either hold that and then, either have an influence over the rewards rates across the network and also earn fees from all the applications that are being powered by BGT or that are receiving BGT rewards. So I think of that as more of like a conservative, stable yield approach, but also depending on size, one that becomes an interesting whale game, right? In that, let's say that someone has a massive position in a stable pool or in, like a Bera honey pool, whatever it is, then they choose to use all of their BGT vote that they've had over time to stake or to delegate to a validator that's directing all their emissions towards that pool, right? They can effectively, start a little bit of a flywheel there of saying, okay, I'm LPing in this pool, it's generating fees, emissions, et cetera. Then I'm going to take the emissions that I gained and use it to vote for more, voting power / more emissions to go towards this pool, therefore increasing its stepped up liquidity, increasing the amount of fees that might flow through it, and increasing the yields that I might get, right? So that's one, form of game theory. The other is someone might just say, okay, cool, like I want to be exposed to the price action of this liquid token. And then they could basically just, hold Bera and then sell it, stake it in other applications on the chain, whatever it may be, right? They might even choose to take that Bera and then LP it and pair it against like a liquid staked version of BGT. And that way they could have a relatively stable, think like ETH, like Steve kind of pair, right? So I think there's a whole bunch of different ways that people can play, but I think the trade-off is effectively earning fees from the network plus influence and emissions versus liquid token. And in any situation to basically have the option to have gotten the liquid token, apart from just market buying, right? If they want to actually have the token that gives them influence over the network's incentives from a rewards point of view, they have to first done the work of providing that liquidity, which is what we think is the right sort of logic.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Is there like some kind of inflation as you are providing liquidity? Yeah. So how does that work?
Yeah. So the block reward / those emissions do come from the network's inflation, and that's basically ramping down over time. There's effectively going to be like a series of like BGT halvenings effectively. So as the network matures, the emissions rate will exponentially decrease, and therefore, of course, those emissions will increase in value. I should hope as they become more rare.
So another thing is Bera or Bear is the gas token, and currently, I think the only way to get it is you have to burn your BGT and redeem it 1v1 against Bera, right? Like, so what is this thought process, right? Like, why is the gas token? Yeah,
I think it's gas and governance play two different roles, right? The gas token is needed to transact on the network, but it doesn't always necessarily make the most sense for someone who just bought the most of the gas token and then contributed in no other manner to then have the greatest control over the network's incentives, as is often the case, right? When you have a gas token that is also the governance token. I think over here, what we're trying to do is saying that the folks who, did the work or provided what I see as kind of a public good of liquidity are those who then are able to help influence the network's direction the most from an incentives point of view and game theory point of view, right? So I think that's a lot of the logic. And in terms of having that, that burning mechanism, I think it also makes sense because for someone who's done that work of providing liquidity, they should have the ability to reap those rewards in some manner, right? Should they wish to do so. So I think otherwise it would probably be unfairly locking people into a mechanism that doesn't make that much sense.
Interesting. How do you see Bera in your entire ecosystem? Is it just like, hey, a necessary evil because you have to do a gas or you have to pay for gas? Or
that's an interesting question. I think it's one in that ultimately BGT and Bera are very closely interlinked, right? As more value accrues to, as more fees sort of flow to BGT over time, I think it also becomes a little bit of a proxy for Bera as well, right? Because at some point there might be X amount of value flowing to BGT holders, and people can think, oh, it actually makes more sense for me to hold this because the amount of value I'm getting over a short period of time is greater than whatever Bera is valued at right now, right? But I think it all comes down to giving people choice in how they want to play things from a risk perspective, or just a market awareness perspective. I wouldn't see it as a necessary evil. I think it's just more of a choice of how you like to play the market.
Interesting. Like bears love honey, and you also have a honey stable coin. So 3 coins in one ecosystem. Tell me.
You got it. Why not? Right. I think that I think that stablecoins are a really useful tool for going beyond standard applications. And Honey is very vanilla. Honey is a very simple stablecoin. We had designs in the past that might have been more exotic, but we also do care a lot about being very legally compliant in anything that we do. And so as such, Honey is just basically collateralized 1-to-1 by USDC. I think there's definitely opportunities that can make it more interesting over time. And, part of the lending market that's built into the chain will allow people to, supply Ether, Bitcoin, et cetera, not Bera to be clear, but Ether, Bitcoin, and exogenous assets in order to borrow honey against it, which is, a nice source of native leverage if people want to be able to maintain their exposure to something while also getting exposure to another asset. So in short, honey is meant, I think, as I very much see it, as something that allows us to help enter new ecosystems, right? So it can be used as a payment layer. If we're looking at partnerships in the Web 2/Web 2.5 space, it can be used to absorb toxic flow and the ability that one can basically, mint Bera against, mint honey against USDC versus just swapping in and out of the pool. And it's overall something that would allow us to bring, the ecosystem into other chains, into other parts of either the EVM or Cosmos worlds without as much friction, right? I think stable coins are easy to set up and pair for and then have a relatively low risk angle. Gas token, et cetera, can be a little bit more volatile. So I think we see honey as something that can ideally be a deep sink of liquidity that a lot of things trade through within the Berachain ecosystem, and then something that eventually helps us expand to other ecosystems over time.
Okay, interesting. So why not use USDC?
Yeah, I think it's largely because while it starts as just USDC, honey can also, I think have more applications over time. And we've also explored different ways that honey can be backed by different assets, as long as there's a high level of legal compliance there. So I think it's more about having that flexibility as opposed to 100% reliance on USDC.
Makes sense. And honey is also tasty, so.
Of course. There's good memetics there. You gotta keep that in mind. Good food.
Yeah, I wouldn't eat USDC.
I wouldn't either. It doesn't sound good.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the validators. They play a very important role in the ecosystem. The dApps are powered by the validators, and validators drive emission towards the dApps is what I'm understanding. Tell me how you guys thinking about the validators?
Yeah, I think the validators have some pretty exciting opportunities. As in, for the first time, they can actually be a part of, the network's economic incentives. They can also work directly with protocols to help those protocols, get off the ground and bootstrap their own liquidity. And I think that's honestly one of the most exciting opportunities, because you can have a validator that chooses to help support a new protocol as they get off the ground. That protocol can effectively, bribe that validator and say, hey, we're going to give you X amount of our tokens that, don't actually have much of a cost to them to emit. And in exchange, you're going to look to route X amount of your BGT emissions towards, our chain, our protocol, right? So it actually is meant as a tool for allowing validators to diversify their exposure to different assets, and B, on the other hand, to actually allow those protocols to have an easier cost of capital acquisition and sort of reach escape velocity or reduce their activation energy to actually get off the ground.
Interesting. And all of this sounds really nice, that validators are powering the dApps, and dApps can bribe validators. But what happens when there are 500 dApps being deployed?
It's a good question. And look, a validator could have multiple apps bribing them, right? So they could really cut that pie up as much as they'd like, in terms of they could be pushing 1% towards app A, 1% towards app B. So it's not a technical limitation. But I actually think that at least right now, right, any Alt-L1 ecosystem can sustain maybe 10 to 15, good applications on the upper end.
Yep.
Right? There's a lot of other stuff that's there, but you tend to see a class of winners emerge. So I think that if anything, it will probably mean that there's a number of validators that support those top applications, and then over time there's others that take a shot at the newer and more exciting ones, right? Just as different risk profiles change as well. So I think that a validator set can sustain as many different protocols as they want. It's more of a matter of actually how good of a job of those protocols do in differentiating themselves, and that's actually part of the goal, right? I don't want forks and just Uni v2, Aave v2, you know what I mean, a bunch of clones on Berachain, because that doesn't feel like it accomplishes anything. I think we're much better served by actually setting a relatively high bar, but then encouraging more people to become part of that, high performing network.
Interesting. And how does one become a validator? Is there a cap?
Yeah. So, just because of the fact that it's Tendermint consensus and it's Cosmos under the hood, there's only going to be 100, give or take a few validators over here. So we have to be pretty careful about what that looks like at the end of the day. So, on our side, we definitely be open. We have a testnet set right now that was curated by the team. And based on, I'd say performance there and or strategic value add, we'll have, that same set or others added from mainnet. So we'll definitely open up applications and try to get, the best folks on board. But since there is a small group and there's been, thousands and thousands of folks that have applied, I think it is, fair to say, unfortunately, that there's a lot of folks who will not be able to participate there. But we'll see where else they can get, involved in the ecosystem from an ambassador point of view, content generation, everything in between.
Dope. So yeah, you have a person looking after India, right? Like, so what are your thoughts on the Indian market?
Yeah, listen, I think that I'm broadly excited about the Indian market and what it can bring us. I think there's a lot of good developer talent. I think that there's a lot of users, though I understand that regulatory has been cracking down there. I think broadly a lot of chains don't do enough work on like international development before going live, or some over concentrate in a given area. Like I know, Aptos did a great job in Korea. Polygon has done a great job in India, so on and so forth. Solana did a great job in India as well, super teams and so on and so forth. I think that the Indian ecosystem has a lot to be like a lot of upside there. I think that I wish I saw more like exciting models / innovation coming out of it, because I do think that I do see a lot of like copycat type stuff. Yep. That's relatively low effort. And I think that sometimes you don't always feel like you're dealing with like the highest integrity actors, but I think if you try to find the right folks within there, there's a lot of gems, and Vish from our team who's there has been wonderful to work with. So I think it's just about finding the diamonds in the rough and the people who know the right folks in the ecosystem. But at the same time, I do think there's a lot of folks you have to be very careful about. So it feels like exciting but dangerous waters.
Interesting. Yeah. Shout out to Vish, good friend, amazing operator. One last question: what kind of people or what kind of projects are you looking at to join your ecosystem?
Yeah, I think on our end, we're most excited about, projects that are doing cool new things, right? And I know that's a very generic way of saying things, but it is really what it boils down to. We want Berachain to be the place that people go to launch cool, new, interesting projects. We're definitely perhaps optimized or have the greatest edge and stuff that's up the angle of DeFi. But nonetheless, right, like if there's an interesting new primitive, we would like to see us living on Berachain first and us helping it get off the ground. So I think that we're broadly fascinated about a lot of things on the edges of DeFi, NFTFi, some stuff in the social finance space. And we don't mean to self-select out on any categories. It's more than just we know where we have the greatest edge from a community appetite point of view and from a chain mechanism point of view. So that's sort of where my instinct would go now.
Awesome. You have your testnet live. What should someone do on the testnet?
Yeah. I would say that, like there will be a couple of Quest platforms that we're working with. So, it's helpful to get involved in those. I also just think that, we'll have a couple of competitions later, especially for app developers, colleges, that kind of stuff. The best thing that one can do is actually just try out the different features. And especially once we have more and more applications launching on it, a number of which already have, but we haven't publicized as of yet, then I would recommend people to go and interact there, right? So, try different things out. Try out some of the flagship like native applications along with the ones that are built into the chain. Because at the end of the day, it is about making sure that the ecosystem succeeds more than just, the chain, the chain enshrined stuff.
Like there was one community question someone had asked when I asked you, Pepsi or Coke, what's your choice?
You're not going to believe this, but I don't drink either. I think that, allegiance wise, I'd probably guess Coke. But I can honestly say that I've never drank Pepsi or Coke in my life, so I have no idea.
Yeah. And which podcast was better, this one or Bankless? Pick one.
I think it's got to be this one, right? Like that's an easy question.
Awesome. Let's go. Thank you. Thank you, Smokey. Loved doing this. Looking forward for the Boobs tech stack.
Of course.
Thank you, man. All right.
Thanks so much, Dhee. I'll catch you later.
Bye.